Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Museums, art galleries, and historic sites are important to every community. They help define our culture, our heritage. They help define who we are as people. We all need to support them, make sure they remain vital. We need to visit them and make sure others do as well. In this episode, we profile a woman who has been passionate about these sites since she was a small child. In her current position, she works with a small group that provides support to those sites in this area, helping them grow and thrive. Our guest is the Managing Director of the Kingston and Area Association of Museums, Art Galleries, and Historic Sites. Her name is Jamie McKenzie-Naish. Jamie, thank you very much for doing the podcast today.
Well, thank you for having me, Dave.
I want to start by getting you to give me a quick overview, a definition of the differences between culture and heritage. Let's start there.
Wow, okay, that's a tough question to start with. A lot of people have different opinions on this. I myself, you could go with the basic ideas, which is what most people think of in terms of the divide. Culture is something you experience that's artistic or creative, going to see a ballet or a show or an art gallery or something that's sort of outside the norm of your day-to-day life, sort of the artistry and the creativity that surrounds us. And then some people look at heritage and history as being quite separate. And the idea of sort of historical narratives or historical facts or experiences that we learn about and perhaps really don't have anything to do with our day-to-day lives, but is something that we learn about in school in a sort of separate, concrete way. Now, I don't really adhere to that separation. I myself use the term cultural heritage because at some point, how do you actually separate historical narrative from creative experience, from human ingenuity, positive, negative, the whole gamut? It really depends on your perspective and where you're standing and where you're looking at things. So I myself prefer that sort of more holistic, more inclusive sort of standpoint on culture and heritage.
Okay. Why did you get involved in the study of museums to start with? Where did this interest start, like way back, I assume?
Way back, and I have to credit really my father. He was in the Canadian military officer, Armored Corps, but his real love was military history. He attended RMC here in Kingston, and he studied history there. And he was just a history nut and read history. As a child, we went to various military forts and museums all the time. That was his interest, and he just shared that with me and my sister. My mother was a teacher and educator, and so reading and literacy was a huge part of our lives growing up. And it was just how we lived our lives. It was really my parents, and that's what we did. I kid you not, like we would be, when we moved to Kingston in the early 80s, my dad, I'd be in the car with him, we'd be driving down, he'd be like, did you know that West Street was actually the western boundary of Kingston, and there used to be a wall here in the, 18 whatever, or who was Sydenham Street named after? And this is sort of it was just infused in our day-to-day lives. And so it was there were places and spaces, sort of museums and cultural heritage sites that just I was very comfortable in, and my dad shared his curiosity and interest with us, and it just sort of built up my own curiosity and interest. And let's not forget about Indiana Jones. Sorry, I'm not going to lie. I saw the Indiana Jones movies when I was a kid, and I thought, hey, that looks fun, right? So that sort of just getting that imagination going about human experience.
Did you go out and buy the hat?
No. No, my parents kept us on a firm budget, so no hat, but lots of imagination, right?
You talk about your dad sharing bits and pieces of history as you're driving down the road. I knew someone who asked me what part of town I lived in, and I told him, and he said, "Did you know that there was a big farm there, and the guy who owned the farm was the guy who the street is named?" He went on and on and on. He had all of this history that he could recall and give you some sense of, which I thought was kind of neat. I can see already this business of you wanting to combine one discipline with another, with your dad being a historical nut and your mom being a teacher. That's something that you decided to pursue once you went to school, is the business of studying museums and also studying teaching. Why did that come accidentally, or was that a part of a plan for you to be able to work in both disciplines?
No plan whatsoever. To be honest, I tended to pursue, in terms of academic studies, what interested me at the time. So my undergraduate degree is in anthropology and classical history. I studied Latin, Roman history, wrote essays on Roman warfare, the expansion of the Roman Empire and whatnot, and looking at archaeology and anthropology sort of from the development of humans and human culture and activities. And then, I did the teaching degree. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a teacher when I was younger, but it was something very practical, and it was something my parents encouraged me to pursue, which I did, and I'm super glad I did. I learned a lot. My take is, if you can manage a group of 30 children at any given time, you can pretty much handle anything that life throws at you. If everyone can leave the room with all fingers and toes accounted for, then it's probably been a successful experience for all. It just sort of piecemealed from there. I do my academics, and then I'd get sick of school, and then I'd want to go off, and I'd go off and work or have some sort of life experience, and I'd get sick of that, and then I'd go back to school, which is pretty much what happened. So I did my undergraduate at Trent. I took a year off, and then I completed my B.Ed at Queen's here in Kingston. And then after that, I actually got my first, what I call my first grown-up job, working as a museum educator at the Military Communications and Electronics Museum here in Kingston. Growing up in Kingston, I was very lucky. As a youth, as a teenager, and as a student, I got those summer employment contracts at all cultural heritage sites that are so numerous here in Kingston, and is such a huge part of our economy. And that set me up really well. And I worked for 2 years at this museum, and it was a great experience. I was very green. I look back and I think, oh, I wish I had done a few things differently. And then I decided it was time for another adventure, and I left. I applied for graduate school in the United Kingdom, and that's where I completed my Master's of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester.
Before we get to Leicester, let's go back to Trent. And you were I
love Trent.
You were talking about the business of studying ancient Roman history and battles and things like that. So I noticed in your resume when I was going through it that you were a teaching assistant for Latin.
Yes. Yeah, I did that.
I didn't think they taught Latin anymore.
Oh my goodness. I did Latin in high school in Kingston.
Well, yeah, I did Latin in high school, but long before you were in high school. So Latin is still why would you study Latin? Was that because the history is written in Latin, or?
Well, so my mom was keen on my sister and I studying Latin, and it happened to be available at our high school, which isn't true, in every high school in Ontario now. And she said, just take, grade 10 Latin, just the introduction. It's great for learning language and understanding. It will, all that. And then I just loved it. I had taken French immersion, which is a very typical Canadian experience in Ontario and in schools now. And I just loved it. I loved the history. I loved the language. We had a phenomenal teacher, Mrs. Morna Parker. We called her Magister Parker. And it just really fired up my imagination. I've always loved stories, imagining human experience in different contexts. And I just love Roman stuff. I was crazy mad for it. I still love it. Mm-hmm. And I just had this opportunity. I did 3 years of Latin in high school. And then at Trent, there was just more Latin to be done. And why not? I even did ancient Greek, though that was harder for me. I didn't enjoy that quite as much. But I don't know. I just loved it. I know I got those questions a lot. Why would you study it? But it was fun. The teachers were great. And, the other bonus was that it tended to be very small classes. Mm-hmm. So I would literally I'd be in a 4th year seminar with 4 other students and the professor. So. Well,
Latin was my best subject in high school, in grade 13, as I recall.
Yeah.
And that's why I sort of keyed in on it when I saw it on your resume. Okay, let's go over to Leicester. So you decide to go over to the United Kingdom, primarily to get your MA in Museum Studies. And
yes,
you did some work when you were there. Again, honing your skills in the museum area as well as the business of teaching. Why Leicester as a place? Any particular reason?
Well, I chose it purely for the academic program. So the Museum Studies program at the University of Leicester, it's over 50 years old. It was one of the first museum studies programs ever to be developed in a Western university context. And at the time, when I was looking at these different programs, because there is, of course, a museum studies program at the University of Toronto here in Canada. And I was looking at the professors and seeing who they were and where they worked and what their interests were. And then I noticed a lot of them had their Masters of Museum Studies from the University of Leicester. And I thought, if I'm going to spend an egregious amount of money on graduate school, and all my professors have gone to this university, and it's in the UK, which is like, who wouldn't want to live abroad? So I went for it. And it was, I went in 2007 and 8. I think I applied in 2005, and then I didn't have my money together yet in terms of loans and funding. So I deferred a year and then went a year later. But, that was basically it. I wanted to travel. It seemed like a perfect opportunity. Like, why go to Toronto when I could go to the UK? And I'd never heard of Leicester before. Didn't know how to pronounce it.
Neither did I, so I looked it up.
No, I know. It's like Leicester, all these extra, the Brits are great for all these extra silent letters in words. I think it comes from Anglo-Saxon stuff. But yes, I had this experience of like, oh, are you going to Oxford? Are you going to Cambridge? And I'm like, nope, going to Leicester. And no one had ever heard of it. But it's this town, a brilliant town in the right smack dab in the middle of England, like, literally on the train route. If you're going anywhere in England from the south to the north, you're going to go through Leicester.
How big a town is Leicester?
Ooh, it's bigger than Kingston. Everything's bigger in the UK. I don't know. Definitely not as big as Toronto. Way bigger than Kingston. Maybe a bit more like Ottawa. Okay. I mean, it's big. The population is
just around a million or something like that, probably.
Yeah. Probably. Okay. There's just so many more people living and congregating on that island than there is in Ontario.
Yeah. Now, you spent 5 years there, from what I can gather.
I did.
And I'm interested in knowing if there are any differences or there were any differences between the approach to museum studies in Leicester vis-a-vis Ontario. Or even the attitude of the people who go to museums.
Absolutely. It was a real game changer for me in terms of understanding how cultural heritage might be understood or even interacted with. The Leicester was sort of a 12-month program, sort of intensive instead of like a 2-year with a break. It was sort of this intensive 12-month program, and then associated with it was a placement. But really, my take on cultural heritage in UK, it has such a different history than it does in Canada. I mean, it really stems far back into that early Victorian period with the expansion of public libraries and this concept of education and children's rights and labor rights, like this whole sort of flowering that things that we still are such a part of our lives now and our histories in terms of, our day-to-day existence. And their concept of culture as public education is much stronger. And they've changed, if you track it all, there'll be points where the museums were charged entry fees, but at the moment, the majority of museums are actually free of admission charges. And watching people engage with these spaces, it's just part of their daily lives. I mean, they go in, there's cafes or stuff, they're at work, they'll go have, lunch in their cafe, they'll go have a coffee, they'll just take their kids, they'll go for a quick peruse through the dinosaur exhibit at the museum and then leave. It's completely different. It's threaded within their day-to-day lives in a way that we don't do that here. We tend to think of museums and cultural heritage as something you do when you're on holiday.
Right, okay.
And it's this very specific context, sort of a tourism experience. I would say that the sector itself has a much more developed and professionalized viewpoint. So, curators and museum education staff and outreach engagement staff, I mean, these are there's clearly defined professional training, employment experiences and sort of expertise that come into this space, and so much more staff. So much more staff, so much more resource. I mean, it ebbs and flows, obviously, in terms of sort of public resources that go into this. But I would say that in the UK, they're so much better at sort of galvanizing their cultural heritage to further their economy. I mean, I don't know if you've ever watched Time Team.
No.
Oh,
sorry.
You got to watch Time Team, Dave. It's like the best TV show. It was like it was on for 20 years. It was an archaeology TV show where they did like this sort of, lightning strike archaeology in 3 days. And I mean, it's on internet. You can watch it now on reruns on Amazon. But this sort of, I don't know, it's just this general concept of culture and people engaging with it. I mean, it's so much more widespread. And it's great fun. I mean, my experience of coming back and working in Kingston is that, local residents don't really visit their museums as much as visitors that come from away. And the concept of tourism, at least in Leicester, was far less developed. I mean, they had amazing museums, amazing collections. But it was just, the people in Leicester would go and hang out. It was what you did.
Now, would these museums in Leicester be supported by government grants, or how did they get their financial support?
So, again, a lot of museums are actually under the purview of, what they call local authorities. So you can kind of think of it as the municipal governments. And so when I worked in Leicester following my degree, I eventually got a job as a education coordinator, which is basically a programmer. And I worked for Leicester City Council, and they managed 6 museum sites and an art gallery. So everyone who worked there were employees of Leicester City Council. And there was the Newark Museum, which was sort of, you can kind of think of it as the traditional like mini British museum, a little bit of everything, some art, some dinosaurs, natural history, history and culture, and all these kind of like, I always think of it as that mini British museum. There was a Roman bathhouse site where my office was. So every day I just looked out my office window into this ruin of a Roman bathhouse site called the Jury Wall Museum. There was Newark Houses, which is this Jacobean house and a social history museum. It was sort of active, that area, during the British Civil War, Roundheads and the Royalists and whatnot. There was Belgrave Hall, which was a Victorian arts and crafts house, or sort of set up like a living history museum. There was Abbey Pump House Station, which was a Victorian water and sewage pumping house with these beam engines that would still operate. And they're just like all over the city. And there was the Contemporary Art Gallery as well, which was managed. And I got to work across all these sites with a variety of people. It was truly, really mind-blowing, like to understand how cultural heritage and museums could be valued and have these professional opportunities with them. I've never seen the like of it.
All under the purview
in the Canadian context.
All under the purview of the city council in Leicester.
Yeah. Yes.
Let's jump ahead a little bit, and you've moved back to Canada, and you've gone back to Queens. And then after Queens, along the way, you started doing a bit of work with an outfit called Laterno Heritage Consulting.
Well, yes, and they're a company in Kingston that does heritage planning and permits and assists in that. Now that was really, I mean, a lot of cultural heritage is sort of built on your professional relationships. So I had a friend who was working with Marcus, and Marcus, who is the owner and the principal of that business. I'm actually a member of CAM, where I work now at one point. I would just sort of, you pick up consultancy work and you do a little bit of work here and there. You assist in a project, you do research. I can't really claim that any credit for any of the work there done there. I would just come in and do some support work here and there and research and whatnot. It was a bit of a digression for me, being a museum educator, but it was really interesting to see how the built heritage side of that worked here in Canada, sort of from a legal permissions point of view, and the tensions, whether both productive and unproductive, between private owners and municipalities and different layers of government, and what Laterno Heritage Consulting does is sort of just assist and work through all that in whatever way needed.
I guess one of the things that sort of struck me was the fact that it seems to be something that is a fairly new business, at least an approach, because what they're doing is working with government or developers and looking at historic sites, and maybe somebody wants to build on that historic site, and how do you handle the business of preserving the history or dealing with it, and the company's like the middle person in all of this is helping figure out the best way to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak, for Marcus, because he is the absolute expert at what he does in this field, but it is really interesting to see the tension. So, and it's also what's required legally, right? And what's not required in a legal context. And it really is. There's we have in Kingston, it makes sense for this business to be based in Kingston because there's so much built heritage in this area. I mean, Kingston is known for it in the sense that it just wasn't totally eradicated or destroyed or rebuilt in the the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then now we're benefiting from the fact that it wasn't modernized in that period. But it really is interesting because there's private owners of these, in the private domain of these beautiful heritage buildings, right? And there are laws at the primarily provincial level that protects this built heritage as part of the sort of civic or public commons. And so this is where Marcus and his consulting business comes in to assist municipalities or larger companies or those individuals, and kind of, I always think of it as a waltz, between the needs and the rights of the individual and the needs and the rights of the whole. And it's complex, and I mean it's I couldn't believe the complexities of it, and it is a fascinating business for sure.
I don't think we want to get into the politics of all of this, but needless to say, I am sure that this is something that applies to communities all over the country as well as elsewhere, where there is a need for more housing and there's space here, or there is an old building they want to knock down to put up a big new building, and these issues come up and they have to be discussed and dealt with. Let's move to what you do for a living now. Now, we call it CAM, and everyone calls it CAM. It's because the actual name is quite long, and it's the Kingston Association of Museums, Art Galleries, and Historical Sites, correct?
Yes, and actually, there's just a minor correction to that, because very recently we've expanded our name a little further, so it's Kingston and Area.
Right, I forgot that part.
Association. I know, because it's always been part of the association. We've always had members from outside the municipality of Kingston, but we've decided to make that more visible and explicit. So Kingston and Area, Association of Museums, Art Galleries, and Historic Sites. It is quite a mouthful.
And why don't you explain what your group does?
All right. Well, I'm currently the managing director of CAM. I came on in mid 2019, and I myself am the third managing director of CAM. Now, CAM itself has a very long history in the area. It actually was founded, a grassroots organization, in 1980, so it's over 40 years old. And essentially, it was just a few cultural heritage sites got together and said, hey, you know what? We need to promote ourselves better. We're not getting really the support from wherever. And hey, some of us have more money and some of us have less money. And let's make a brochure and hang out and give each other some collegial support. And that's a very simplified sort of tongue-in-cheek version, but it's how I like to put it. And sort of from the earliest days, there is this real sense of collaboration. So these individuals, who work at these individual sites, and some of our member sites, they have a lot of staff, a lot of budget, and some of them are basically volunteer run and sort of run through, I say, spit and love. And they came together, and sort of the main criteria at that point, or one of the main impetuses, was to create a collaborative brochure so everyone could sort of benefit and communicate with audiences and draw more audiences in. And it sort of went from there. It was just a volunteer run organization. So individuals who worked at cultural heritage sites just did additional work and spent additional time outside of their, paid employment positions and their personal lives. And they just hang out. They talk about issues. They try to sort of bring in, facilitators and trainers for professional development and ongoing learning. They sort of organize collaborative programming together. And it went on and on and on. And, it really is. The history of the organization is so amazing. That's sort of that true collaborative spirit. And I think that is unusual. And they did it in the days when there was no sort of additional funding or recognition for this. Tourism Kingston hadn't even really existed yet. Our destination marketing organizations, weren't even created yet. And Kingston really was one of the first regional sort of museum networks that came into being. And, sort of going along years and years. And they did various things, like they did a hands-on heritage history camp for kids, all sorts of things. Any sort of First Capital Day, which used to be a popular event, and National Indigenous Day, like all sorts of just things. And the museums and the cultural heritage sites would get together and basically promote, say, come visit us. We got lots of cool things going on. And then essentially around 2009, sort of in the late 2000s in Ontario, we were seeing sort of a downloading of responsibility for cultural provisions from the provincial level down to the municipalities. And at that time, that came with sort of a funding envelope to get things going. And of course, Kingston, the municipality of Kingston, the city of Kingston, has always had a strong sense of culture and tourism. It's always been a part of our economy. But this just kind of further galvanized and organized it, sort of gave it a purpose for organization. And around that time, the city council was looking to develop a funding program, a grant program for local cultural heritage sites and organizations to support them in their work. Anyone who works in cultural heritage or arts would tell you that there's never enough money and there's never enough staff. So a creation of a new funding program is actually quite an innovative and strategic investment from the side of Kingston City Council. And they decided that it couldn't be a program that was run directly out of the city, and they wanted to ensure sort of support of the professional sector. So around this time, there was talks about CAM running this program for them, and in order to do that, CAM needed to incorporate and become its own sort of legal entity. under the CRA and the provincial government. So CAM incorporated in 2009, and we became a nonprofit organization. And in those early days, they worked. Our board worked quite closely with the city of Kingston. They hired their first managing director, who was Anne Blake, and worked quite closely with city staff, in particular Paul Robinson, who was city curator at the time. And they worked on developing not only sort of CAM's constitution and bylaws and purposes and structures and policies and all the things that come with running an organization, and also developing the groundwork and the framework for this City of Kingston Heritage Fund program. And so that was sort of a definitive point of development for CAM. And then from there on in, CAM just sort of continued to develop in a professional sense. So professional staff were hired. There was, of course, a managing director hired. There was an office coordinator hired. And, first managing director left, second one came in. She developed and further developed the organization. And then when she left, I came in. And we continue to work and grow as an organization. Now, we are very focused on supporting the professional sector. So our organization is a little bit different because we don't interact sort of directly with the general population. Our role is really that of a professional association, and we support cultural heritage sites and cultural heritage professionals in doing their best work.
How many sites are involved with CAM right now? How many member sites?
We have I think we have about 34 sites that are open to the public, sort of in the concept of a museum or an art gallery or a historic site. We also have several archives that are members. So we have the Queen's Archive and this is such a long name. I always call it the Hotel du Archive, but it's the Religious Hospitallers of St. Joseph Regional Archives. We have the Providence Sisters of Providence Archives. We have individual professionals. So our members sort of fall around over between 50 and 60 at the moment, but the majority of them being sites, like cultural heritage sites that welcome members of the public onto their site for learning and engagement experiences.
At the beginning of the conversation, we talked a little bit about the business of the difference between the museums in Leicester and the audiences, or if you will, or the people who visit these various museums. And the counterpart is what happens here in Kingston or in other parts of Ontario. And the fact that we don't seem to have as many people wandering through our museums on a regular basis other than tourists who are coming in from out of town. Obviously, if you have 50 or 60 member sites or archives or whatever working with CAM to try to promote museums in general, I guess that begs the question for the general public is, why are museums and art galleries and historic sites important today? A lot of people who believe that history isn't as important as what's happening right now or what will happen. Give me your philosophical take on the business of why.
Okay. Well, I think traditionally people look at cultural heritage, that idea, of doomed history. If we don't know about our past, we're doomed to repeat its mistakes, and that's fine as far as that goes. But really, for me, what sort of draws me to cultural heritage sites is they can be and they can also not be. So it's a hard sort of place to get to, but they're these sort of beautiful spaces that are outside of our day-to-day lives and yet intimately interwoven with them. And they're a space where we can encounter human narrative. And that is fundamentally what museums and cultural heritage sites do. They tell stories. Human beings, we are story-making creatures. From the earliest sort of inceptions of humanity and our ability to sort of create abstract symbols and abstract thought, creating, from the earliest days of what we think of as cave art, depicting human activities and assigning meaning to that. So these spaces are these sort of wonderful, for me, I mean, this really drives me, these sort of magical windows into experiences that can reflect and validate your own sense of self and your own histories and something that is immediately relevant to you and your community. But it also allows you to engage with histories and narratives and stories and experiences that aren't your own. And for me, museums and cultural heritage sites, it's not always have to be a positive, validating experience. In fact, I think there's a lot of value when these spaces are quite provoking and unsettling and almost even at times disturbing, because ultimately how we as human beings live together and function together in all our variety and all our diversity and all our perspectives is this ability to imagine other. And for me, these are what these sites allow us to do in these public commons, these public spaces. And, it's the same value of public education, public libraries. They sort of fulfill the same function. And it can be this beautiful place for dialogue and expression and learning. And, your experiences of what you see in that museum or that cultural heritage space might reinforce your perspectives and your own identity. It might challenge them, and it might open you up to other people's human experiences. And museums don't always get it right. Like I love museums. Like obviously I work in museums, and I believe in their productive opportunities. But the museums and cultural heritage have a long history, particularly sort of in Western thinking and approaches that haven't always been positive for everyone who's encountered those museums, and it can be a quite alienating experience for some. However, in terms of 21st century museum and cultural heritage practices and best practices and professional ethics, we're seeing there is a shift, and there's no definitive right answer, but it's a learning process where we're learning to not only engage and serve communities, but bring communities into these spaces. I mean, cultural heritage sites, they're a human activity that relate human activities for the benefit of humans. And if, humans aren't included in that, then there's no point. So, I mean, people write dissertations, there's research upon research about, the pros and cons and different approaches. But I do fundamentally believe that the core value of these sites is really expanding our own sense of self and seeing other sense of self, other people's sense of self, and understanding how we might connect and how we might disconnect with that as well.
Do you think the popularity of people going back and doing genealogy has helped with museums, art galleries, historic sites? Do the interest in going back and finding those stories about their own relatives, and whether that sort of prompts them to check into what other people are thinking about?
That's an excellent question. I can't say that I've ever sort of thought specifically. I myself, I'm very curious about my own family genealogy and whatnot. I think it like anything. I think there's positives and negatives or the potentials for positives and negatives in anything. It depends on, I guess, your fundamental purpose. Are you seeking information about the past in order to better understand your present and live within your 21st century community, or are you using it as a means to build barriers? And both both valid and difficult at the same time perspectives. I'm a kind of it's a strange thing, we human beings really are strange creatures in our and how we try to exist. And we do seem to need boundaries as much as we need the ability to perforate those boundaries. That's a very abstract way, but I think museums and these cultural heritage sites are sort of these spaces where we can do that safely and hopefully respectfully and ethically with each other.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting study, and I know there's still a lot of work to be done in this whole area. Mm-hmm. And I do appreciate the work that you do with your group and the various sites around town and all across various communities. And I want to thank you for the time you've given us today.
Thank you so much. I hope it was of interest.
It was.
To someone out there.
Yeah. Take care.
Thanks, Dave.
Jamie McKenzie-Naish, the Managing Director of the Kingston and Area Association of Museums, Art Galleries and Historic Sites. If you'd like more information on the organization, visit their Facebook page or their website at www.kingstonmuseums.ca.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.